Okay, we are live streaming, and I will share my PowerPoint.
So we're good to go?
I think so.
All right. Well, good morning, everybody that's here. Thanks for being here. I know it's a busy time of year for everybody. But welcome to the Preparation and Entry Subcommittee meeting for October 20th. I'm Hank Weddington, and with Van Dempsey, we're co-chairing this subcommittee. I continue to thank you for your work. Go ahead, Kim. You have the agenda sent you in the documents in the folder that Kim sent out to everyone. Hopefully you've had a chance to take a look at the agenda. Can I get a motion to approve today's agenda?
So moved. This is Erin.
Thanks, Erin. A second.
I'll second.
A double second. Was that Laura?
I was one of them, Christina.
Okay, Christina, thank you. So the agenda is approved. Very nice. And you can see there, it's a little different setup today, but same kind of idea of a breakout session and a whole group sharing with a little bit more time to work, and Van will walk us through that. You also received the minutes from the September 22nd meeting. Hopefully you got a chance to review that as well. Can I get a motion to accept those minutes?
So moved.
Thank you. Who was that?
Heather.
Heather's moved. And a second, please.
Christina again.
Christina again. Thank you, Christina, for being a good seconder today. The minutes are approved. Okay, move ahead. Again, I won't read these to you. I think we all are aware of our norms at this point, and this group is especially good at making sure to hear and respond and engage in this process, and we continue to be thankful for that, so thank you. And again, everything we do, as your idea, have impact on students, that measurable in an authentic setting. And again, I think everything that we've done at this point has stayed right aligned with that. And again, appreciative of that. And here's just a reminder of our responsibilities as a subcommittee and the other subcommittees' work and how they overlap. And that giant Mickey Mouse or koala bear in diagram there. I won't go back over that again, but we are, starting to really narrow down at this point and having a document that we can submit back to PEPSC with some recommendations. I think we're getting close, especially after today. Yeah. And I'll go ahead and turn it over to Van now to get us started on the breakout sessions.
Sure. Thank you, Hank. Good morning, everybody. Hope you're all having a good morning and a good week so far. I want to echo Hank's thank you for your time and energy and thought and focus on this. We made some really good progress, and we're going to continue that with the template that you see up on the screen. What we're going to do is go into breakout groups, and we're going to continue to try to populate the template with recommendation language that we can use to move forward as we start to develop the full set of recommendations across all the subcommittees and report back to PEPSC. I want to remind people when you're in breakout groups that as we're discussing this, it's really helpful if you phrase a comment as a question to then phrase it as a statement, to think about it in terms of recommendation language. And if we have a question, what would our answer to our own question be? And that's what the recommendation, that's the form the recommendation language needs to take. And so we really want to make sure in this template that we get that language documented, and we're not expecting clarity so much as getting people's ideas down so we have enough clarity to continue to refine the document. When people get in the breakout groups, you're going to have a shared template. Everybody's going to be working off the same template.
No, there's one per group.
Okay, so each group will have their own set, and then it'll get synthesized after the meeting. So if you remember from the last meeting, we took multiple breakout groups work and pulled that into one document, into one synthesized document. So the folks at DPI will help do that after the meeting. So if you have questions, please let us know or put it in the chat. Otherwise, we're going to go into the breakout groups. We've got 45 minutes to work on this, which sounds now like a lot of time. I suspect that 45 minutes is not going to feel like a lot of time. But we'll come back out, have a conversation across the breakout groups, talk about synthesis of what we do, and then next steps after today's meeting. So everybody's going to be in a group. You're going to have the template in your group. We're going to ask that someone facilitate and someone be a note taker. Make sure we're getting the language down on the template. Record your thoughts and discussion points on the document. And the title for each Word document indicate the session number and group that you will be in. So, Kim, I think we're ready. Unless there are questions, I think we're ready to go.
Okay, there's only 3 groups instead of 5.
Okay.
Just to let everyone know. And I'll set our time for 45 minutes, and then I'll start the groups.
Hank, we could barely get our breakout group to talk. I don't know what was on.
None of us like to talk at all, do we?
Kim?
We're all back.
Excellent. Well, I can't wait to hear people's conversations. And, you know, Christina, we didn't determine who's going to share out from our breakout group. We could do a chorus if we want to. But, Kim, if we'll use the same routine we've used in the past. If you'll call out the name of a group and people can,
Sure will.
we can be somewhat more extended in our comments today because we're not going back into breakout groups and we've got time to play some of this out.
Sure.
So, Kim, if you call on our first.
So I think group one, Hank was going to speak. Is that right, Hank?
That's right. But please jump in, others, because I'm sure I didn't capture everything. So we did a little bit of cleaning up, first of all, on the sheet that we were given. And the first thing that we talked about was in the license 3 area, and there's or, which allowed somebody who was admitted to teacher ed to be a license 3 teacher, and we struck through that because we felt like that didn't make sense with the intent of what we had done in license 1 and 2 in apprentice. The other or that we removed was at the bottom of the apprentice, where it said you just had to be admitted to a community college, maybe in a teacher pathway. And we felt like that probably didn't make a lot of sense either, given our past discussions that somebody should have completed AA or completed 60 hours of their undergraduate degree to step in at the apprentice license. I think Heather astutely pointed out that could have a 17-year-old in high school who's been admitted to a community college who could potentially jump in as an apprentice, and we talked about how terrifying that could potentially be for everybody. So those were the 2 areas that we cleaned up. We keep coming back around, and I know that advancement and development, I guess, are working on an idea of competencies, but if we were going to have the level 1 and the level 2, then there has to be some kind of way to measure an increase in competency level to get from 1 to 2, because they both are basically people who are holding a bachelor's degree and affiliated with an EPP. Now, I will say that was another thing that came up in our conversation, is that across all 4 areas that we looked at, that we did want some kind of affiliation with an EPP. And that EPP could potentially be the ones offering micro-credentials if that's the way we end up going, but we weren't looking for outside vendors or some kind of new alternative route that we wanted the EPPs to still have a hand in it, some kind of affiliation there. We talked, Olivia gave from the state board side of things a lot of great input. One is that, you know, some of these are going to make us do some work to the policies around licensure that currently exist, especially around limited and emergency license. And it might allow us to clean up some of those areas, since we would have a pretty clear track to full licensure at this point. We talked about the testing at level 3 and what it was for, and accountability. The system in place is EdTPA and the Praxis 2 exam and the Pearson exam. Are they to hold the EPP accountable to a certain level, or is it to show final competency, or is the EVAS data more about competency of the teaching, and is there disconnect in people's understanding of why we use these measures, the potential that the EVAS data may not be a true reflection of how well a person has been prepared at their institution, but that EdTPA and the current testing gives us a way to show that at least we made students demonstrate a proficient level of performance and content knowledge before we let them out into the classroom so that we felt comfortable in recommending them. One other thing, I brought this up, and please jump in others, is that if this new system, if a major portion of this new system or a major purpose is to incentivize people to go into the teaching field, to move through these levels and have potentials for salary raises along the way. And the question is the money better spent paying for all these bumps, the new apprentices that would be paid, the mentors that would be necessary, and the potential extra money it would cost to give them the release time? Or is the money better spent incentivizing on the front end by scholarshiping people who want to go in to the teaching profession? And that could be, as Heather said, daunting, because then they're committing to, potentially 8 years in a career that they may decide they don't want to be in. But what if it was even scholarshiping the junior and senior year once they are admitted to a school of education and have chosen that major? I guess the question is the system about incentivizing people to come into the field and continue in the field, or is it a way to deal with a teacher shortage to find as many routes in as possible? And I think that's kind of a recurring question that's come up in all the subcommittee meetings that I've been in. So we ended up talking about those things quite a bit, and time ran out, crazily enough. Did I miss anything from our group?
No, Hank, this is Olivia. You did a nice job with that. May I ask, I just want to ask one question you can just, I'm timing myself, 15 seconds. So here's the question. For me, I still have this question about how long will it take to cross all columns of licensure? 4 years, 3, to get from apprentice out to 3 or 4? Are we adding some period of time to migrate from one level to the next? Is that have we talked about that, or are we going to talk about it in the future?
Yeah, I think we have talked about the need to have some time limits for how long you stay in a particular area. Others, please jump in. The thought being that if you come in as an apprentice and you have to at least have your program done, or an AA, that, within 2, 3, maybe 4 years, depending on if you're going full-time or part-time, that you would be able to finish your program at the EPP and and then move into a fully licensed position. But others, I don't.
This is Jeff. I think the original vision of the framework, and I think Christina just put this in the chat, was that there's limits, not necessarily a minimum amount of time. So I think the important thing to remember, at least again based on the framework, is that the goal is for teachers to get to license 4. That's what we would consider now a continuing professional license that's based on effectiveness versus meeting a bunch of minimum requirements. And so there would be time limits placed on how many years you could remain in the license 1, 2, 3 space. So I think the original discussion, and I don't know that this has been discussed or decided on by any of the PEPSC subcommittees, would be, a 5 to 6, maybe 7-year time frame. But to get to license 4, you would have to demonstrate at least 3 years of effectiveness on the measures that are determined by this group. And so, you would have essentially 5 years based on the original framework. And so if you're not able to demonstrate 3 years of effectiveness in those 5 years, then you would not be allowed to move on, and essentially your license would be you would no longer have a license to teach. So, if that makes sense.
Well, that helps to have that context around that clarified is important, will be important for the board.
And the other thing I wanted to piggyback on something that Dr. Weddington just shared is that, or the question you asked, I think I've always thought of this new framework as both incentives and a way to streamline sort of entry into the profession. Is that currently, no matter what level you come in, if you come in with just a bachelor's and no experience with pedagogy or experience in the classroom, or you come, out of a EPP, fully recommended, having completed all the requirements for a license, you essentially start at the same place in our system. And so this new framework was intended to both incentivize progress towards becoming a more effective teacher. So if you've come through a traditional EPP and having met all of the requirements for what we consider to be a initially licensed teacher, then you're going to start off at a higher license level and a higher pay than somebody who's coming straight into the profession without any experience. And so I think that's the incentive part. But I also think it makes it simpler for teachers who are entering in through non-traditional routes to understand what their requirements are and then what they need to do to move towards full licensure.
So the oddest question of all that I will ask is this one. Olivia Oxendine can't decide to remain at licensure level 2 for the duration of my career. Okay?
That is correct.
That odd question, but it was necessary.
No, that's right. It is a temporary license, essentially, that is intended to be like a stepping stone to a more permanent license. I think in the same way that you can't remain an initially licensed teacher currently, you eventually move into a CPL, or you're recommended not to be for a continuing professional license.
Yeah, so all the more reason to know about the transition points along this continuum. Thank you.
I guess since we're on that subject about time and progression, I've assumed the intent is you cannot regress. You can't, you're in license 2 or you're in license 3, and for whatever reason you didn't meet the expectations to maintain that license. You don't get to go back to license 1 and start over, or license 2 and start over.
I think that's right.
Okay.
But that changes once you get to one of the 4 pluses, right? Because if you didn't continue to have effectiveness data that reflected advanced teaching role, then you could convert back to a 4. Is that right?
Well, it would have salary implications also, I would imagine.
I think this is Andy, I think one of the groups has talked some about what would happen. So you become a license 4 based on those 3 years of effectiveness. What would happen if you go the next 3 years or the next 5 years and don't have that? And that's something that that the committees have to work through.
Well, Kim, let's go ahead and move to the next group. I'm just trying to be mindful of time.
Sure. I think it's your group, Van.
Okay. I'm going to attempt to summarize. Aaron Horn, Tom was in our group, and Christina was in our group, and me. And if I miss anything, please make sure, but I'm going to try to hit the key points. First, the most important key point is we had a great conversation. It was really good. We focused primarily on on the first row, which is the minimum credentials question to hold the license, and then we talk, it sort of interfaced with the compensation question. One of our areas of focus was we were looking at the conditions that are currently in License 3 for admission to teacher education in an approved undergraduate EPP program, and then other components that are listed there, and talked about whether those conditions were better placed in License 2 versus where they were currently, where they were when we started the conversation, which is License 3, and trying to align that language better into what may be the more appropriate licensure area. And then we went back and looked at License 1 and License 2 and talked about what language we might want to change in those to be consistent across License 1, License 2, and License 3. We talked about the issue of the way we currently have it posed as minimum credentials to hold the license, and that credentials may point us to a discussion and a set of deliberations that actually aren't the appropriate deliberations. Randy and Christina had brought that up in previous discussions and previous meetings, and talking about evidence and proxies for evidence and outcomes that a person in the licensure area holds versus a set of credentials that the person holds. We had a part of the conversation was about the important differences between someone who completes elements of a program at a licensure area but doesn't have the evidence of impact. So they may have completed the structural components of a pathway area, but the evidence of them having a positive impact on student learning is not present. And what does the term completer mean in that particular case? And that the goal is to get to the successful practices that lead to success for learners, and what the evidence of that would be. We also talked about the question of interns in EPP programs, whether it was an undergraduate program or a post-baccalaureate or master's level program, and what it means to be an intern relative to the level of practice you've attained as compared to License 1 and License 2, which then led to a couple of good conversations. One is about keeping the what we currently call License 3 intact. We don't want to break that up and start to sort of dismantle components of the way we understand EPP structure now. So keeping the internship either within that structure and understanding the role that the internship plays in that structure, or if we were going to start to think about attaching licensure in some way to the internship, would that sit better in License 2 or in a different licensure component altogether? Part of the reason for that conversation, the impetus for that conversation, was about the question of compensation and financial support for people who are in the internship, whether that's at the undergraduate level or the post-baccalaureate level. And then the final point was this question about the acquisition of evidence, that as a person, as we're looking at people in different parts of the pathway, one of the foundational components of that is that the person's got to be able to exhibit evidence of having a positive impact on student learning, and how critical that is in all of the pathways and all of the different ways that a person can be licensed. Christine, I don't know if I've missed big parts.
I don't know. The one part that's crucial for me, I don't think you necessarily missed it, but I just want to emphasize it, is that we had a lot of conversation around needing to kind of hold the line on entry to License 3 is completion of an EPP. Implied in that is proficiency on whatever the competencies are, the knowledge, skills, dispositions, right? Or the equivalent in terms of measuring those same competencies, right? So that somebody who enters License 3 has all of those competencies which currently are marked by EPP completion. And that was the big thing about, what is there now in the current document with the or, where it was like admission to candidacy or basically the equivalent of a residency license. That doesn't belong there, right? And that's that was the starting point. But just making sure that we're holding the line on that License 3, having that minimum level of proficiency that is currently marked by EPP completion. So I think that was really important.
Aaron, and Tom, any other comments or additions?
Tom had to step away for another meeting, just to let you know.
Well, then I'll just make up things Tom said.
I'm back. No, I didn't hear everything Christina had, except that tail end, which I think is very important to me, is that we're very clear about the connection between EPP completion and the actual demonstration of the competencies that we feel are that would be required for these different license levels. And I just really feel like that gives EPPs flexibility to enter this new system wherever they're comfortable with. Like, we're not telling them what they have to do, but we're defining what it means to be able for their program completer to be a license 3 or a license 2, whatever.
Thanks, Tom.
Okay. Can I ask a quick question on that, just to make sure I'm understanding? So what you're saying is that just strict completion of an EPP program is not sufficient, but EPP completers would still need to demonstrate the competencies through, but just for shorthand, let's say the EdCPA and the Praxis 2, to be able to qualify for license 3. But I think a safe assumption is that our EPP completers should be able to demonstrate those competencies, because that's the intent of the program, is to get those individuals through those competencies. Or are we saying that completion of the EPP is sufficient for demonstrated competencies?
We're saying it's.
We had that conversation. Yeah, we definitely had that conversation. I think that what we're saying is that whatever the competencies are, right? So whatever those competencies end up being determined to be, that we keep talking about, right, is that EPP completion would require proficiency on those competencies, right, as it currently does. It currently requires the COTC. It currently requires EPP completion no longer requires, well, it depends on the EPP, right, but at the state level, we don't have to have EdCPA or Praxis currently, but that there's a minimum level of competency measured, and this is something we talked about too. It's really important that everybody be, whatever pathway, that the competencies are measured in the same way.
Right.
That we determine what those competencies are and they're measured in the same way, but that since we know, right, that EPP completion currently, as it currently stands, is a marker of quality teaching, that we imagine that those required competencies would be somewhat similar to what currently is considered EPP completion. But that simply having that EPP completion wouldn't be sufficient unless EPP completion is tied to those same competencies.
Got it. Okay. So essentially you're saying it's meeting the competencies. Got it. I got you. That's great. Thank you.
Yeah, Jeff, I want to add one additional point, and particularly for people at the state level. This is, and it goes back, I think, to Heather's made a point earlier. This has underlying market forces, and I frankly get frustrated individually that we don't want to talk about across the board. We don't want to talk about that part as much as we need to. That if we're saying to EPPs, based on the data we know, that your graduates are able to create the outcomes that we're looking for in student learning at a higher level than any other pathway, how do we acknowledge that and recognize that in candidates who choose that route to come into the profession? And that we would want to reflect that in the compensation models, that if the bar, as Christina just described it, is set at that level, that we got to make sure that's reflected in how the state rewards the profession. For people who choose to go that license 3 route, and they're there when they complete the EPP, Or they come to another route and at some point they complete the same they complete this at the same level of a success, the indicators that are used in the EPPs. It's about the competencies and the evidence of practice and being able to show those. And that should be reflected in those forces that I just talked about.
Absolutely agree.
Van, I have a question about, so if let's say we're using the same measures we're using right now for EPP completion, licensure completion. If you had somebody who, say, didn't pass Ed TPA or didn't pass the Praxis 2, currently we've got the right to let them out, right, to go ahead and take a residency license job or as they finish their other requirements. Does level 2 then become a place where those students could potentially live until they do meet those other competencies? I'm still struggling with what license 2 is for at this point. And the best I can figure is that it's a way to incentivize continuing movement towards that license 4 eventually, which is great. But are we putting forward by what you and Christina were proposing that if you complete an EPP, you have to complete everything, but you don't get to complete, that we're not going to put them out there without having met all the measures and competencies? Or could they actually?
Hank, I think the problem is that we don't know what those measures and competencies are, right? And that's where I keep getting stuck, is like, you know, I feel like just having this piece about credentials there forces us into a box of thinking in the way that we've always thought and saying, oh, well, they have to have this degree or this amount of coursework or this GPA or this test score, when I think the intent is to get away from that. But in order to get away from that, we have to have those competencies defined and levels of competency defined so that we can say, like, level 3 is proficiency on all of the competencies. Right? Whatever those competencies are that we agree on, level 3 is proficiency. Maybe level 2 is proficiency on 80% of the competencies, right? Or it's developing on all of the competencies and proficiency on X%, right? And level 1 is, you know, some other measure on, you know, but without having those competencies, we get forced back into saying, you know, it's this test score, it's that thing, which I think there's been a lot of conversation about whether or not those measures are appropriate, right? Which is how we're in the mess we're in now with the Ed TPA being kicked down the road and the, you know, Praxis being kicked down the road. And, you know, so right now EPP completion does not require the test scores on Ed TPA or Praxis, right? It's basically just a COTC, right? And yet we have, you know, evidence that EPP completion makes a difference. So I think, you know, the test score question thing, that piece is still, I think, really up in the air for me, because we don't have, in the absence of this measure or this way of thinking, defining and measuring the competencies that we're talking about, I feel like we can only make so much progress without that.
To Christina's point, this is Olivia. I think you're hitting on all the right buttons there, because if I think back and reflect several years ago, more specific, probably 3 years ago, one of the reasons for the roundtable was to, one of the kind of central pieces of the roundtable was to come up with and think about other ways to measure effectiveness, teacher effectiveness, other than our traditional state board policy test, licensure test. So that I think that needs, and I'm not saying that doesn't stay uppermost in everyone's mind. It probably does, but just to, as a way to keep it fresh. The other piece is, yes, because my question is, I learned earlier today that there is maybe a subcommittee that's working on these unanswered questions around competency standards, these markers that are going to be necessary to move across the continuum. So I agree, Christina. That would add a lot of clarity and remove roadblocks for me going forward.
So this
But
is
the
Tom.
alternative ways to license, that's what the State Board of Education will be happy to hear about. Other ways to determine effectiveness in the classroom.
Yeah, I am very sensitive to the plight here of this group of defining or understanding what those competencies are. And we're really working with the licensure subcommittee to develop those and understand what those are. But increasingly, it seems to me that the conversation is turning towards we have to define what it is we expect these folks to be able to do as a condition of license 1, as a condition of license 2, and a condition of license 3. And I think everybody can help contribute to that understanding, even though the measures themselves are in licensure. But I think it would be really helpful for this group to start really articulating what should a license 1 teacher be able to do? And if that's just simply possess a bachelor's degree as a way to enter them into the profession, that's fine. But then we need to start thinking about, okay, so what are the specific skills and competencies, not the measurements of those skills and competencies, but what are those skills and competencies that they need to possess to be a license 2? And I think in addition to that, since this group seems to be driving that conversation, what are the requirements of oversight and supervision for a license 1 teacher? If we're going to allow them in the classroom, and I think this group is particularly struggling with the issue of letting a license 1 teacher loose with a group of 30 kids and saying that's okay. And I'm on board with that. But we need to say what that looks like in terms of supervision. Is that has to be supervised by a license 4 teacher at least 60% of the time, or whatever that definition is. And then what is a license 2 teacher able to demonstrate skill-wise and at what level? So I'm with you, Christina, that a license 2 may be able, we may say they need to demonstrate classroom management skills. They need to articulate skills and differentiation of content, blah, 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 at a developing level, whatever that looks like. And then license 3 has to have all those skills at the proficient level. That, I think, so it's a two-way street here. Licensure is struggling with what are the competencies we're trying to measure. And because we're creating measures, but we don't know what the competencies are. And I guess we have to push one group, to say this group seems to have a really good idea of what those competencies should be. And I think ultimately what we're going to uncover is our standardized tests might cover some of those competencies, but it's doubtful they will cover all of those competencies. And so it may be that we're looking at, you could have the test plus these micro-credentials or blah, blah, blah. But I think this group is the right group to really nail down what we expect our teachers to be able to do if you're going to be in a position where we're confident that you can have a classroom of students unsupervised, not unmentored. I don't want to, that's a separate thing, but unsupervised by a license 4 teacher. And I feel I just killed all the conversation in the room. I'm sorry.
Well, I was hesitating to say it because I feel like it's going to come off as the lobbyist for EPPs. But the bottom line is we've established the fact that it is route to becoming a teacher that is most likely to lead to positive outcomes for students. So given what we know about EPPs, if we think about the template apprentice, license 1, license 2, license 3 as a progression more than a set of independent buckets, and you're in one or the other and you jump out of one, jump into the other, it's a progression. We already know what that progression looks like in concept with EPPs. We expect a set of experiences before they're even admitted into a major. I'm not suggesting everybody's got to look like an EPP, but I am suggesting let's don't act like we don't have a lot to learn from the EPPs. Apprentice is most like that first 2 years, 60 hours pre-major experience. And then depending on how different EPPs structure their programs, you've got that license 1, license 2 component of the progression. There's building evidence and building competencies around content knowledge, building evidence around pedagogical knowledge, and building evidence around the ability to integrate them and apply that in a classroom. And then you get to what we call license 3 internship, which is where you get to the end of that progression within an EPP. And we're also saying, at least indirectly in the template, in the pathway document, that we would expect people who are coming into the profession to follow that progression like they do in EPPs. It will be structured differently because of the way they occupy space within the profession differently. But I'm not suggesting let's take EPPs and make everybody look like that. I'm just suggesting let's learn from what we now know is the best route to becoming a teacher, which is the structure of EPPs. To Christina's point she made a few minutes ago, a critical question becomes what gets built in on the back end. They're quote finishing, they're at license 3. What competencies do they have to exhibit and how to say they have attained that status? We also know some things from that. I mean, right now, for lack of better ways of putting a pin in a map, EdTPA is one of those. EdTPA is a performance assessment. We seem to have endorsed the idea of a performance assessment. The question is EdTPA the right performance assessment? Or is there something that we can use that would be better?
Van, I think that's a great way to think about it. And I think it's, and Kim, Andrew, Tom, Craig, I think the advancement committee has sort of taken that approach because I think it's advancement. They're looking at both the, and I'm blanking on what the name of it is, but the rubric that's used to assess the skills of an intern teacher through the EPP, so that cooperating teacher, student teacher assessment, and then the NESIS as helping to define what those competencies should be. And I think that mirrors exactly with what you're saying, is that it's that learning continuum that we need to be paying attention to. And I think to EdTPA, thank you, Christina, the teacher candidate evaluation rubric. I think the EdTPA is another good one. And it'd be interesting to break down what are the competencies that performance assessment is measuring, and thinking that if that's become the de facto measurement, then that would identify what those skills are that we expect to see coming out of an EPP, and hopefully someone that would be qualified for a license 3.
Thank you, Jeff. I do want to say, in the interest of time, because of a great conversation, we now have 23 minutes left. Kim, and I think we have one more group.
We do. So it's Laura or Cheryl who could share out.
Sounds like we're both hesitating. This is Cheryl. I need a minute to pull up our notes, but I'll begin by just saying our discussion went in many of the same avenues as the other discussions. We focused most of our time on the minimum credentials to hold licensure, and similarly to what others have shared, we immediately zoned in on that license 3, and that idea, we took out that option for residency licensure there. We had a good bit of discussion around license 1 and license 2. And we also are lacking some clarity on exactly how these differ. We ended up almost flip-flopping what was in our original columns to move many of the requirements that were listed under License 1 to License 2, and to move License 1 to being a BA and hold a non-teacher preparation bachelor's degree with 24 hours of credit, and then keeping the CTE area the appropriate credential for certification. We were just beginning to work on the minimum evidence row, and we were having some discussion around the apprentice level and whether we would want that requirement for them to have had some type of field experiences in schools or some kind of background experience that's expressed there, like substitute teaching or having been employed as a teacher assistant. I don't think there are any other big key differences from what our colleagues have shared, but if anyone else in my group would like to speak up, please do. Okay, I think I'll turn it back over to you, Van.
Thank you. Any questions or comments? I'm giving people time to think. While we're thinking, I'm going to propose something. The template that we have is not, this was something we put together as a tool for people to have the conversations and, load notes and recommendations into it. Would there be an objection? My screen has disappeared. Would there be an objection to altering the over in the left-hand column of the first row? I think it says minimum credentials, and we change that to minimum competencies, because that seems to be an anchor point that works well. I think Christina talked about that in our breakout groups. And Kim, I think it's a Word document. We just need to edit that language on the document.
So let me ask a question to you, Dr. Dempsey. Are we thinking about the word minimum being the same as expected competencies? Do they probably mean the same thing, I would think?
We could probably use both. We could say minimum.
Because my question would be, what do we have a sense of a body of competencies that we desire? Or is that to be determined? Or are they already in place?
I think we have some things that are a starting point, right? So we have the EdTPA measures research-based competencies, so right? So and that's a summative assessment. So in terms of like what that level license 3 should look like, I think EdTPA gives us some of it, if not all, right? I think there's some things, EdTPA has had its critics, right? It maybe doesn't hit on everything that's important. And we have NISAs and PCE, which theoretically are aligned to one another, but in practice, not exactly. So I think, I think they're a starting point. As I said in the chat, I think they need some overhaul. But I think that, there's definitely good stuff in there that, we don't need to throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. And, and there's a body of research that we have to draw on as well. I mean, we have, I have this book, I mentioned it in our last meeting, Darlingham and Bransford, did a sort of an exhaustive review, edited work on preparing teachers for a changing world, what teachers should learn and be able to do. We have decades of work that can inform this, right?
So that's good.
So, yeah, so I think there's a lot out there, and a lot of that is already, as Dan pointed out, sort of embedded in how we do things in EPPs. So I think, drawing on these different resources, we can definitely identify what are some competencies. It's defining. For me, the challenge that comes in is, it's like the conversation we had early on about separating content and pedagogy. It's not one or the other, it's some level of both. And so it's not like these are the competencies that one needs at a level 1. It's sort of at what level does one perform those competencies at a license 1. So it's not, for me, it's not about like, oh, well, to be a license 1, they have to have these competencies. And to be a license 2, they need to have these competencies. It's more, at what level do they integrate those competencies?
Right. That's key to me.
And orchestrate, right? It's really like conducting an orchestra. And so like teaching is a lot like conducting an orchestra, and it's not like, okay, I can conduct the clarinet, but I can't conduct the drums, right? You need to be able to do all of it at some level, and that level of progression. And that's where this work really gets hard for me, because I think, you know, for me, that like what defines a level 1, what defines a level 2, and what defines a level 3 probably looks something more like on a rubric, you're at developing, you know, you're a license 2, right? Or you're developing on most of the competencies, something like that, as opposed to like, you can do a lesson plan, you're a license 1, and you can, do you know what I'm saying there?
Yes.
It's hard to carve it up into individual pieces.
So this is Tom. I agree with that, and I'm thinking. So one of the challenges that the establishment of the competencies, I think, is really good work. Does that book kind of clearly laid out what those competencies are? Are they kind of indexed in a way that we could easily grab them for a future meeting to say, all right, here's what Linda Darling Hammond says about the competencies, or like Deborah Ball's high leverage practices, something like that, where we can get a list of those skills so this group can see what those skills and competencies are and say, yep, we want that one, we want that one. And then that's really going to help the licensure folks develop the measures by which you would demonstrate that competency, because you've said, here's what the competencies are, and then they can start working on how we measure those things. And what we want the licensure folks to do is develop multiple pathways for demonstrating those competencies. If the licensure exam and the EdTPA are sufficient to determine that somebody's met those competencies that we care about, that's great. That's one pathway. But then we have to think about, if you're doing this through micro-credentials, what do those collection of micro-credentials look like? And at what level would you have to meet those, the requirements to be a license 1, 2, or 3? And then I want to go back to this idea of NESIS and the teacher, the TCE. Like, if we're doing some kind of qualitative review of that, how do we incorporate multiple perspectives on that so that we're not in a situation where, you know, there's a lot of bias in that system, that we can eliminate the biases that we know is inherent in principal observation, which I would assume to some degree is inherent in the TCE evaluations. We've got to make sure we're washing that bias out in some meaningful way. Does that sound like what we're trying to build here?
Yeah, I think I think where we are is if we sort of put our eyes on that blue line that's on the pathway document. So you've got license 1, 2, and 3 to the left, and you've got 4 and beyond on the right. That's a critical professional threshold, and we're saying that people who cross that line have shown mastery, competence, and evidence of practice on a set of complex competencies that basically put them in license 4. And then what we're doing is backward mapping that back through the progression. And Olivia, to your point earlier, a person that you don't start with one competency area and then pick up another one and pick up another one. You start with, what are the minimum? For someone to be licensed 1, you got to have this minimum set. And there's got to be a minimum level of evidence / performance. the set becomes more complex and the performance becomes more complex. And I think that's easier to, in my mind, that's easier to map backwards than it is to map. If we say we have some sense of why that blue line is where it is, and the EPPs are our, that's sort of our best aggregation of that, then how do we back that into a plan?
Well, I think you're on the right track in terms of back mapping, because for me, I would be able to develop going back based on the ideal scenario of the expert teacher. Back mapping, it becomes very useful in terms of filling in all the other pieces.
And Christina, can you put the title in the chat, if you wouldn't mind? Appreciate that. Tom, I think yes to what you just said, and now it's it would be a tactical question of what are the what's in that set of competencies. We may have to create some tools. We have we have CPAS, we have pre-CPAS, we have EdTPA, we can learn from national board, we have state tools, and then we have the kind of analysis we were just talking about when Christina made reference to the book earlier. I think the answer to your question is yes.
All right. So
10 till, by the way.
So just to be clear, for DPI folk on here, our assignment for the next meeting is to distill some of this research and pull out these competencies that we can get in front of this subcommittee for our next meeting. And Aaron, I'm assuming North Carolina State Library might have this book.
I'm going to guess. I just saw the title. Thank you, Christine. I didn't catch the title when she said it. A lot of people on the call probably have that book.
Yeah, it's not going to be difficult to get.
Okay. I'll try to get my hands on this book. Maybe my son can check it out for me from the North Carolina State Library. And we'll work on kind of pulling out these major components. And then I know in other subgroups, these high leverage practices from Deborah Ball have come up. We'll try to pull a bunch of these competencies and get them in front of folks so we can start saying, yeah, we like this, we like this, because then that's going to be really helpful with the licensure folks, because then we can see where those things are covered within the rubric, the NESIS rubric, the TCE rubric, potentially other potential sources of feedback that could, we could set up that qualitative observation pathway. We could set up the micro-credential pathway. We could set up a standardized testing pathway so that we're sure that everybody has equal opportunity to demonstrate these requirements. Because I don't want that to fall off our map. Is that one of the things we're trying to address here is our minority students struggle, even though they can demonstrate these skills and competencies in the classroom setting, they struggle with showing that performance on a standardized assessment. So trying to open up those other pathways to licensure for them that are equally rigorous, but allow them to demonstrate their skill and competency in a way that allows them to move forward.
Tom, this is Olivia. As you talk through that scenario, the tool that came to mind, I don't mean to add homework to your list, but the tool that came to mind goes back to a point that someone made about not throwing the baby out with a whatever. Could be a crosswalk tool to capture competencies that are already built into the system, in our systems?
Yes, I think I do think that's part of what we're talking about here. We know that TCE and the NESIS and there are professional standards for teachers incorporates a lot of these competencies and skills. Our challenge here is, you know, what I have to say from the measurement perspective is that we know that at least the NESIS system does not have sufficient reliability across observers to support a statewide licensing function. That is, you're going to get variable performance from the same observation rating. And that's what we want to guard against because this is a statewide licensing enterprise. We have to have some standardization of the inputs or the outcomes actually that yield a statewide license. So that has to look the same, as we say, from Murphy to Manio. It can't be that somebody's getting this because the observation process may be weaker in one area and stronger in another. That's what but the underlying measurement seems reasonable. You know, using qualitative observation to create this pathway. Yes, I think that's what we would all like to see, but the issue becomes the measurement associated with that.
Well, and observation tools can be reliable if there's training and calibration, right? So I think, the bias can be, bias can never be eliminated with any kind of a measure, right? But it can be mediated. And, I think the problem that we have currently, that some of us have tried to work on, like here at UNCG, for example, for the teacher candidate evaluation rubric, we developed our own. The state doesn't offer any kind of training or calibration, so we developed our own, and we require our evaluators to calibrate annually on the teacher candidate evaluation rubric, so that we have some kind of data reliability associated with that. I think that's really missing from our current system. So you're right, there is a lot of bias and there's a lot of variability in the ratings on the NESIS and on the TCE, but that can be addressed. The tool itself isn't necessarily, you have to have a quality tool to begin with. It doesn't have, double-barreled and triple-barreled items and that kind of thing. So, the tool itself needs some revisions. But then, you can address the issue of reliability through training and calibration. So I think that's something that's surmountable.
So I'd like to agree with you on that, but I'm not quite there yet. As the guy who holds the data on principal evaluation across the state.
We've got, sorry to interrupt, we have 3 minutes left. Tom, if you needed additional work, I plugged InTask into the chat, which has also been mapped with micro-credentialing structures, by the way.
Yes.
Before Hank, we adjourn, Patrick Miller has sent out a note to the co-chairs that he intends to convene the co-chairs of the 4 subcommittees to attempt to start a process of synthesizing synthesizing the work across the 4 committees and also creating a sense of consistency and continuity across the way this is coming together. Four different sets of authors writing 4 different parts of a book, in essence. And so I think Patrick asked that in November we would have that meeting in lieu of the subcommittee meetings. And then once the co-chairs have had a chance to pull their work together, then we would put that synthesized work back out to the subcommittees. Am I remembering?
So we would have the November meetings.
Okay.
Yes.
And then after the November meeting, we would start that.
Yes.
Okay.
And so the December meetings, we are working on being able to have something to inform the subcommittees more about micro-credentials. So there'll probably be some joint subcommittee meetings around micro-credentials. So that's in the works right now. So those are not completely canceled as well.
Well, and in the November meeting, if we could think about this, how we've shifted from credentials to competencies, and then some of the conversation we just had, that may be quite informative for the next round of fine-tuning this. Hank, I'll turn it back over to you.
Okay. Well, 1 minute to spare. That's perfect. Great discussion as always. Get all these brilliant people in line and good things happen. So I will take a motion to adjourn this meeting today so we can get back to work.
Laura, so moved.
Thanks, Laura. Any a second?
Heather seconded.
Thanks, Heather. We are adjourned. Hope you have a great rest of your day.
Very
Thanks,
good
everybody.
work.
Everybody.